I still wake up expecting to hear him move around the house. Not footsteps exactly, just the soft proof that someone else is breathing in the same space as me. Since his death, the mornings arrive without warning, quiet and heavy, like they're testing whether I'm ready to face them. I wasn't prepared for how fast the world would move on when mine had stopped. Papers were signed, condolences were delivered, and life rearranged itself around the absence of my husband as if he had never been here at all. Our marriage wasn't dramatic. There were no screaming matches, no grand betrayals, no cinematic moments worth retelling. We were steady. Predictable. He was kind in a way that didn't ask questions, and distant in a way that never felt cruel, just constant. We shared responsibilities more than emotions. I used to think that was enough. After he died, I realized how many things I had never said to him and how many times I had swallowed my own loneliness because it felt selfish to want more. Grief didn't come to me as tears. It came as routines collapsing. I stopped cooking real meals. I left lights on in empty rooms. I talked out loud just to hear a voice that wasn't echoing. At night, I slept on the far edge of the bed even though there was no one else there, as if leaving space might somehow invite him back. I didn't miss him the way movies said I would. I missed being seen without having to explain myself. That's when my brother started calling more often. At first, it felt natural. He was worried. Everyone was. He asked if I'd eaten, if I needed groceries, if I wanted company. I told myself it was normal, family stepping in when a life cracks open. He would sit across from me at the table, not forcing conversation, just filling the silence so it didn't swallow me whole. I appreciated that he didn't push me to talk about my husband. He talked to me like I was still a person, not a widow. The calls stretched longer. The visits became frequent. Sometimes he'd stay late, long after the sky outside the windows had turned black, and we'd talk about nothing important. Childhood memories. Small annoyances. Things I hadn't realized I'd been holding in. I didn't notice when I stopped checking the time while he was there. I didn't notice when his presence stopped feeling like help and started feeling like relief that I should have. There were moments, tiny, fleeting ones, that made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't name. A pause in conversation that lasted a beat too long. The way he looked at me when I laughed, as if he was memorizing the sound. I would feel it and immediately dismiss it, blaming grief, exhaustion, my mind searching for something solid to lean on. I told myself I was imagining things because imagining them was safer than questioning what they might mean. That I never spoke about it to anyone. Not even to myself. I labeled my feelings as confusion, then shoved them aside. I reminded myself that he was my brother, that I was vulnerable, that nothing inappropriate was happening. Those thoughts became a script I repeated whenever something inside me tightened for no clear reason. After my husband's death, I had become someone people checked on but didn't really see. With my brother, I felt noticed again. Not desired, at least, that's what I told myself. Just noticed. He remembered how I took my tea. He asked follow-up questions. He listened without trying to fix me. The more broken I felt, the more his attention seemed to hold me together. Guilt crept in quietly. It wasn't loud enough to stop me, just loud enough to make me uncomfortable. I would catch myself waiting for his messages, feeling a small spark of disappointment when the phone stayed silent. I hated myself for that. I told myself I was replacing one loss with another kind of attachment because I didn't know how to be alone. I promised myself it would fade once the grief settled, but grief doesn't settle. It shifts. One evening, as he stood near the door getting ready to leave, neither of us moved for a few seconds. We didn't touch. We didn't say anything that crossed a line. But something hung between us, unspoken, undeniable. I felt it in my chest, sharp and confusing, and I immediately looked away, embarrassed by a feeling I hadn't invited. After he left, I sat alone and tried to trace the moment back, to find where it had come from. I told myself it was nothing. A misread signal. A side effect of loss. I went to bed convincing myself that tomorrow would be different, that boundaries would naturally reassert themselves once I was stronger. That I didn't know then that strength wasn't what I was lacking. I was lacking honesty, with myself most of all. And that night, as I lay awake staring into the dark, I couldn't shake the sense that something had already begun to change, even though nothing had happened yet. The request didn't come dramatically. There was no build-up, no emotional speech, no pause that warned me something was about to change. He said it casually, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. He told me he thought it would be better if I didn't stay alone for a while. He said his place had extra space, that it would only be temporary, that it might help both of us. He didn't frame it as something I needed. He framed it as something that made sense. That I didn't answer right away. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. My mind started racing through explanations before I even knew what I was trying to explain. I thought about how empty my house felt at night. I thought about how often I reached for my phone lately. I also thought about how wrong it felt to hesitate over a request that, on the surface, was harmless. Family supports family. That's what everyone says when they don't want to look too closely. That I asked him if he was sure. He smiled and said of course. He said he worried about me being alone too much. He said he hated the idea of me sitting in that quiet house every night. He didn't say anything inappropriate. He didn't need to. The concern in his voice made it harder to refuse than any pressure ever could. That I told myself I was overthinking it. I told myself that grief had sharpened my instincts in strange ways, that not every feeling meant something. I agreed, but I added conditions I didn't plan on enforcing. I said it would only be for a short time. I said I needed my space. I said we had to keep things normal. He nodded, too quickly, as if he'd already decided the details didn't matter. Moving in didn't feel like a mistake at first. It felt practical. I packed lightly, as if convincing myself that I wasn't really staying. The first few nights passed quietly. Separate rooms. Polite distance. Shared meals that felt almost domestic in a way that made me uncomfortable if I thought about it too long. I avoided that thought by focusing on how much easier it was to breathe there. What changed wasn't one big moment. It was the absence of resistance. I didn't feel guarded the way I expected to. I didn't feel watched. I felt understood. He noticed when my mood shifted and adjusted without asking. He learned when to speak and when to sit in silence. The more time passed, the more natural it felt to reach for him emotionally, and the more unnatural it felt to question why. Late nights became routine. Conversations stretched past exhaustion into honesty. I talked about my marriage in ways I never had before, not because he asked, but because he listened. He never defended my husband. He never criticized him either. He just acknowledged the gaps I had learned to live with. That validation sank deeper than I wanted it to. I started catching myself before words came out of my mouth. Not because they were inappropriate, but because they were too intimate. I would stop mid-sentence, suddenly aware that some thoughts should stay private, even from someone who felt safe. Each time that happened, I felt a flicker of panic, followed by relief when he didn't push. That relief was dangerous. It taught me that I could get close without consequences. There were moments I noticed only after they passed. sitting too close on the couch, sharing looks that carried meaning I couldn't define, laughing and feeling lighter than I had in months, then immediately feeling ashamed for it. I told myself healing didn't have rules. I told myself I deserved comfort. I never told myself to stop. The first time I questioned my decisions seriously, I was already too deep into it. I woke up one morning disoriented, forgetting where I was for a few seconds, and when I remembered, my chest tightened. I wasn't thinking about my husband. I was thinking about how easily this new routine had replaced the old one. That realization scared me more than loneliness ever had. That I tried to pull back in small ways. I spent more time alone. I went to bed earlier. I reminded myself of boundaries without stating them out loud. But boundaries that live only in your head are easy to ignore. Every time I created distance, he respected it just enough to make me feel unreasonable for wanting it in the first place. One night, the conversation shifted without warning. Not toward desire, not toward anything explicit, but toward vulnerability so raw it felt exposed. He talked about his own loneliness, his own emptiness, things he had never said before. I listened, fully aware that something was unfolding that couldn't be undone. I felt needed in a way that had nothing to do with grief. When the moment ended, nothing had technically happened. No touch. No confession. No line clearly crossed. But I sat there afterward with the unmistakable sense that something essential had moved inside me. I realized then that the request to stay hadn't changed my life on its own. That it was my willingness to say yes without asking myself why. By the time I admitted something was wrong, it had already become familiar. That was the most unsettling part. Nothing felt sudden anymore. Whatever tension existed between us had settled into the background of everyday life, woven into routine so seamlessly that I barely noticed it unless I forced myself to. We didn't acknowledge it, which somehow made it stronger. Silence became permission. That I started measuring my days by his presence. Not consciously, not proudly, but accurately. I knew the sound of his movements in the house. I knew when he was tired by the way he spoke less. I knew when to joke, when to listen, when to let the quiet sit between us. That kind of awareness doesn't appear overnight. It grows slowly, fed by attention and proximity, until it feels inevitable. That I told myself this was still innocent because nothing physical had happened. I clung to that distinction like it was proof of my integrity. But emotionally, I was already somewhere I had no right to be. I shared thoughts with him that I had never shared with my husband. I waited for his reactions. I adjusted my words to keep him engaged. I noticed when he noticed me. Every time I caught myself doing it, I felt a jolt of shame, and then I kept going. What I didn't expect was how easy it was to justify. I told myself my marriage had been quiet for years, that I had learned to live with being unseen. I told myself my husband was gone, that loyalty had limits when the person you're loyal to no longer exists in the same way. Those thoughts made me uncomfortable, but they also made sense when I needed them to. I used logic to drown out guilt. The comparison started without permission. My brother listened differently. He asked questions my husband never did. He remembered details. When I spoke, I felt like I mattered, not just like I was being tolerated. The moment I realized I was mentally contrasting the two of them, I felt sick. I told myself to stop. I didn't. There were nights I lay awake replaying conversations, wondering what he meant by certain words, certain looks. I told myself it was harmless curiosity. I told myself I was projecting because grief had stripped me raw. But I also knew that if someone else had been watching us, they would have seen it. The closeness. The way we leaned toward each other. The way we paused before pulling away. At some point, the guilt stopped being sharp and became dull. That scared me more than anything else. I could live with pain. I didn't know how to live with numbness where my morals should have been. I still thought about my husband, but those thoughts no longer stopped me. They hovered in the background, heavy but ineffective. The realization hit me one afternoon when I caught myself smiling at a message from him and immediately hiding my phone, even though no one else was there. That instinct, to conceal, to protect something private, was the clearest sign of betrayal I had experienced so far. You don't hide what you believe is innocent. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at nothing, fully aware that I had crossed a line I could no longer see clearly. That I tried to pull away emotionally, not by creating distance, but by reminding myself of consequences. I imagined my husband watching, imagined the disappointment, the confusion. I imagined what this would look like if it were spoken out loud instead of hidden in silences. For a brief moment, clarity broke through. I knew this was wrong, not because of rules, but because of what it was doing to me. But clarity doesn't last when it threatens comfort. Did he sense the shift before I said anything? He always did. He didn't confront me. He didn't demand reassurance. He just became quieter, more careful, as if giving me space while still remaining close enough to be felt. That restraint felt intimate in its own way. It told me he understood without asking. It told me I wasn't alone in this confusion. There was a moment, small, easily missed, when our eyes met and neither of us looked away. No smile. No tension release. Just recognition. It felt like standing on the edge of something neither of us had named but both of us acknowledged. In that moment, I understood that it didn't matter whether anything physical ever happened. What mattered was that I wanted it not to end. That thought terrified me. That I didn't want to be this person. I didn't recognize myself in the choices I was making or the justifications I was building. But I also didn't know how to undo what had already taken root. Emotional distance requires a kind of discipline I no longer trusted myself to have. Every attempt to retreat felt like a loss, and I was already tired of losing. By then, the truth was unavoidable. I hadn't fallen accidentally. I had stayed. I had leaned in. I had allowed something forbidden to feel necessary. And even though nothing had been said out loud, even though no touch had sealed it, I knew with certainty that I was standing at a point where turning back would require more strength than moving forward. That was the moment I understood that whatever came next would change everything, not because I wanted it to, but because I had already let it. What finally crossed the line wasn't dramatic. There was no rush, no moment that felt explosive or reckless. It happened quietly, the way most irreversible things do. One conversation went too far, one truth slipped out without being pulled back, and suddenly we were standing in a place neither of us could pretend we hadn't chosen. It wasn't the act itself that changed everything. It was the certainty that followed. The moment passed, and instead of relief or excitement, I felt hollow. The room didn't feel warmer. The closeness didn't feel comforting. It felt final. I remember thinking that grief had never made me feel this exposed. Loss had been heavy, but this felt sharp, like I had cut something open inside myself and didn't know how to close it again. Silence followed in a way that was different from before. It wasn't peaceful. It was weighted with understanding. We didn't look at each other the same way. Whatever ambiguity had protected us was gone. I realized then that ambiguity had been the only thing keeping this from feeling like a betrayal. Without it, there was no story I could tell myself that made this acceptable. That I thought about my husband more in those days than I had in months. Not with longing, not with regret over the marriage itself, but with a sense of having failed something sacred. I hadn't broken a promise he could confront me about. I had broken something quieter, the memory of who I had been when he was alive. That realization settled deep and refused to move. My brother tried to talk about it. Not to justify it, not to celebrate it, but to understand where we stood. I couldn't give him an answer. I didn't trust any words that came to mind. Every option felt wrong. Staying close felt like continuing the betrayal. Pulling away felt like another kind of loss I didn't know how to survive. Distance arrived anyway. Not because we planned it, but because neither of us knew how to exist normally after what had happened. Conversations shortened. Eye contact became brief. The comfort that had once felt effortless now felt dangerous. I started noticing the cost of every interaction, measuring how much it took from me and how little it gave back. Living with the consequences was harder than facing the moment itself. There was no dramatic fallout, no confrontation from the outside world. The damage stayed contained, which somehow made it worse. I carried it alone. I carried the knowledge that I had chosen something that could never fully belong to me without destroying something else in the process. Eventually, I left. Not in anger. Not with explanations. I told myself it was for clarity, for healing, for space. But the truth was simpler. I couldn't stay somewhere that reminded me of the person I had become. I needed distance not from him, but from the version of myself that had learned how easily lines could blur when loneliness was involved. Time passed. Life reorganized itself again, just as it had after my husband's death. From the outside, everything looked stable. I rebuilt routines. I filled my days. I learned how to be alone without reaching for someone to soften it. But some nights, when things were quiet, I felt the weight of what I had done settle back into place. That I didn't lose my brother completely. We found a way to exist at a distance that felt safer for both of us. But whatever we had been to each other before was gone. Trust doesn't always break loudly. Sometimes it just thins out until there's nothing solid left to stand on. I've thought often about the moment he made that request, about how small it seemed at the time. I understand now that it wasn't the request that changed my life. It was my readiness to accept something that felt like relief without asking myself what it would cost me later. Grief makes you vulnerable, but it doesn't make your choices meaningless. I learned that the hard way. Some decisions don't announce themselves as mistakes until long after they're made. By the time you recognize them, all you can do is live with the version of yourself they create. That I don't tell this story because I want sympathy or forgiveness. I tell it because people like to believe betrayal only comes from desire or cruelty. Sometimes it comes from exhaustion. From loneliness. From the quiet need to be seen when you feel like you're disappearing. After my husband's death, my life changed in ways I expected. After my brother's request, it changed in ways I never saw coming. And even now, with distance and time between me and that version of myself, I know this much to be true. Some lines are crossed long before you realize you've stepped over them, and once you do, there is no way to return to who you were before, only to move forward carrying the weight of knowing you chose wrong when you needed yourself the most.